So what is up with chondroitin sulfate helping to reduce the risk of a heart attack? If you haven't heard about this before, it's actually been floating around the internet for decades. Let's now take a look at the actual research on chondroitin sulfate as it pertains to heart health benefits. So here is the actual very first paper on chondroitin sulfate and heart health. It dates back to 1968 when a doctor essentially gives chondroitin sulfate to 60 older people with heart disease, and he compares those people to similar people, 60 similar people who were not given chondroitin sulfate, and everybody was followed for 1.5 years. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yeah, there probably wasn't a lot of chondroitin sulfate floating around health food stores in 1968. So what they did was they actually got the trachea of cows and they purified the chondroitin sulfate from that. So at the end of this 1.5 year study, what actually happens? So the doctor reports that in those people who were taking chondroitin sulfate, there was only one heart attack, a fatal heart attack, among all the 60 people who were taking the supplement. However, in those who were not taking chondroitin sulfate supplements, there was actually 13 heart attacks, 7 of which were actually fatal. So from this preliminary report, it was concluded that not only did chondroitin sulfate lower the risk of heart attacks, but also lowered the risk of fatal heart attacks as well. However, this is not the end of the story. Here's another paper from 1971 titled Reduction of Ischemic Coronary Heart Disease by Chondroitin Sulfate A. Now, I want you to realize this is likely the very same study as the first paper I presented. However, this paper lasts for 4 years. Again, just as before, 60 people are given chondroitin sulfate supplements and 60 people are used as a control. 4 years later, it's reported that there were only 4 heart attack deaths in those 60 people who were taking chondroitin sulfate. This is compared to 9 fatal heart events in those who were not taking chondroitin sulfate supplements. And if we add up all the fatal and non-fatal heart problems that were experienced in this study, we find that there was a total of 6 heart issues over 4 years' time in those who were taking the chondroitin sulfate supplement. However, in those who did not take the supplement, it was a whopping 36 cardiac events. However, we're not done yet. This same researcher yet again publishes another paper, this time in 1973, titled Coronary Heart Disease, Reduction of Death Rate by Chondroitin Sulfate. And I do want to point out that I don't think this is a brand new study. Rather, I think this is a continuation of the first 2 clinical trials I presented to you. And just as before, we have 120 people, 60 of them get chondroitin sulfate, the other 60 don't. 6 years later, they report their findings, and again, the very same intriguing outcome is reported. Both men and women taking chondroitin sulfate suffered fewer heart attacks and other heart problems compared to those people who were not taking the supplement. As you can see from this table, there were 6 heart problems that were reported in the chondroitin sulfate takers. However, it was 42 heart problems reported in those who were not taking the supplement. If we drill down a little further, there were only 4 fatal heart attacks in the supplement takers compared to 14 fatal heart attacks in those who were not taking chondroitin sulfate. In other words, that's more than 3 times as many fatal heart attacks in those who were not taking this supplement. Now, if we move on a few more years, we come to yet another study that came out in 1979. Here we have 48 elderly people that are actually living in a senior living facility, and they're treated with chondroitin sulfate and they're followed for 5 years. Compared to those individuals who did not take the supplement, these researchers are also reporting that chondroitin sulfate reduces the risk of dying from heart disease. Additionally, chondroitin sulfate appeared to lower cholesterol levels, and it caused the blood to take longer before it began to clot. Again, this indicates that chondroitin sulfate has a blood thinning effect. Now, if we skip ahead a few decades to 2021, we have this paper titled Risk of Acute Myocardial Infarction Among New Users of Chondroitin Sulfate, a Nested Case Control Study. Over 23,000 people who had acute heart attacks and over 117,000 people who didn't were followed for up to 14 years. And I will point out that there were people in both groups who were taking chondroitin sulfate. However, the use of chondroitin sulfate was actually more prevalent in the people who were healthier. However, when they crank the numbers, they come to this very staggering statistic, and that is that chondroitin sulfate supplements were associated with a whopping 40% reduction in heart attacks. Furthermore, it's also reported that these heart-healthy benefits of chondroitin sulfate are seen in both men and women, regardless regardless of their age. Benefits are also seen in both short-term and long-term users of chondroitin sulfate. It seemed to work equally as well in people who were taking NSAIDs like aspirin as well as those who were not taking NSAIDs. And chondroitin sulfate appeared to work best in those who were at high risk and intermediate risk of heart attacks. However, it didn't appear to work so well in those people who were at low risk of a heart attack. And one other interesting outcome here is it's also reported that glucosamine sulfate supplements were not associated with a reduction in heart attack risk. And I will point out that this is the opposite outcome of other investigations of glucosamine. I will link to my glucosamine and heart disease research video below so you can see more about that. And now moving on, we also have another paper which came out that same year in 2021, Glucosamine and Chondroitin and Mortality in a US NHANES cohort. These researchers followed 16,000 people for almost 9 years. The researchers reported that the use of chondroitin sulfate and glucosamine sulfate was associated with a 65% reduction in heart disease death and an almost 40% reduction of dying from all causes. Now, while that is pretty impressive, I will point out that they don't actually report the amounts of chondroitin sulfate and glucosamine sulfate that the people were actually taking, and that's a drawback, and it's one of the reasons I'm inclined to throw this study out. Okay, so here's a summary of the studies I just presented, and from what I can tell, we have several clinical trials that appears to show that chondroitin supplements are associated with fewer heart attacks. However, out of all of these studies, I personally think the first 4 you see here are the best because they actually involve giving a known quantity of chondroitin sulfate to people to see what happened. The other papers are basically observational studies where they follow people for several years to see what happened and they ask them, were you taking chondroitin or were you not taking chondroitin sulfate? So this actually begs the question, how did we begin doing pretty good research in the 1960s and 1970s and then regress to essentially doing observational studies decades later? So I can't speak to that, although I would say that when I see a trend like this, it does kind of make me want to dust off my tinfoil hat. Okay, so if chondroitin sulfate really does work, how does it work? So that's something I personally think that we still don't fully understand yet. However, there is some really interesting research that hints at possible mechanisms. One possibility is that there may be an anti-inflammation effect going on here. For example, both glucosamine and chondroitin sulfate appear to reduce C-reactive protein levels, and this effect appears to be even greater in women. And one more thing that I think is even more tantalizing is that when animals are given chondroitin sulfate, it has been shown to latch onto plaque in the arteries and reduce the size of those plaques. Okay, so if you're interested in this, you're probably wondering how much chondroitin sulfate should you be taking? Okay, so here is a table. It's a summary of the amounts of chondroitin sulfate used in the studies that I just summarized. And as you can see, the dosage tends to range from about 1.5 grams to 4.5 grams a day. And I wouldn't worry much about the 10-gram dose you see in some of these studies because they were some of the first studies. And it does appear that what they did in the beginning was basically do a loading phase where they gave people about 10 grams of chondroitin sulfate for the first several months. And then they cut back to about 1.5 grams per day thereafter. However, as you can see in at least one paper, a benefit for heart health was also seen in people who were apparently consuming less than 800 milligrams a day. So as for how much chondroitin sulfate works, if I were to spitball it, I'd say it probably ranges somewhere between about 800 to maybe 1,000 to maybe 1,500 milligrams per day. Although I also would point out that we still don't know the optimal amount of chondroitin sulfate for this use. And I would be remiss if I also didn't say that all these studies have problems, and I really wish we had better clinical trials on this, and I don't know why nobody else is picking up this mantle and doing the good research that needs to be done on chondroitin sulfate and heart health. So if you're intrigued and you want to try this for yourself, number one, I would say run this past your doctor because there is evidence that chondroitin sulfate is a blood thinner. And if you're taking blood thinners, what does that mean in terms of interactions? And additionally, I personally am still squishy on the idea of men using chondroitin sulfate supplements because of highly preliminary research that appears to show this supplement may be linked to prostate cancer, which again reinforces what I said earlier. When in doubt, talk to your doctor.